HQ presents Frontline Nurse by Rosie James. Read by Anna Cordell. Chapter 1. November 1900. Randolph Garfield stood on the quayside and watched the last huge roll of tobacco being wheeled into his main warehouse. He nodded, satisfied at the superb quality of this consignment. But what had he expected? Virginian tobacco was the finest in the world. As usual, his trusted foreman was checking each roll as it was stored away safely, and Randolph glanced at his watch. It was late, and all the other workers had already gone home, but they would be back here again tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock sharp. Observing the proceedings closely, as he always did, Randolph tightened his hand on his walking cane. He liked the feel of its smooth, round marble head beneath his palm, palpable even through the fine kid gloves he was wearing, and considered the cane as something of a talisman, because it had belonged to his father, who had never left the house without it. Garfield Tobacco, its name marked out in huge steel lettering across the entrance of the 3 warehouses, was well known in the East End, as it had been for 2 generations before Randolph. His father had died very young, which meant that Randolph had had to accept leadership of the family firm earlier than he might have expected. But he was not resentful in any way. He had been born into prosperity and enjoyed the life of the prosperous, and was giving 3-year-old Alexander, his only son and heir, the same privileges. So it was highly likely that Alexander too would follow in the family footsteps when Randolph no longer wished to head the business. He shrugged briefly. There was plenty of time to worry about that, because, after all, he was only 40. When the warehouse was fully secure, Randolph began to make his way from the docks, envisaging how those gigantic rolls of tobacco would soon be transformed into thousands of cigarettes, cigars, plug and pipe tobacco and snuff, all supplying the never-ending needs of the public, rich or poor. The pleasure and solace of smoking was a gift of the gods, certainly a gift for Garfield's. It was a miserable late November evening, the gloom only slightly lessened by pale overhead lighting. Randolph took his usual route from the docks along the cobbled streets, past rows and rows of ramshackle terraced houses and countless pubs. He had long since become accustomed to the poverty and deprivation all around, the overpowering scent of unwashed bodies and human excrement, of coal smoke hanging permanently in the air, the persistent smell of beer. There were always groups of children hanging about outside, few wearing any shoes, and who never seemed to go to bed, whatever time it was. Randolph doubted any of them had ever seen the inside of a classroom, despite the Education Act 3 decades earlier having decreed that education should be compulsory. Throughout the area, various sorts of trading seemed to go on. There were countless private beer and cider houses, and women offering rags and old pots and pans for sale. A prolific number of people were engaged in the dangerous process of matchmaking, while little match girls stood on every corner hoping to sell for a few pennies, and very young children persistently offered themselves to anyone willing to pay for it. Once Randolph had been approached by a small girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, earnestly offering him a good time. He had been appalled and had brushed her away, but the incident had haunted him for a long time afterwards. But there was no doubt that the economy was booming. All the workshops and factories along the docks were doing well, including that of his great friend Jacob Mason, whose business was in steel and the manufacture of nuts, bolts, and allied merchandise. Randolph walked on with a lighter step. It was a wonderful feeling to be successful at what you did. He and Jacob spent many happy hours discussing current topics and airing their opinions about the government. The 2 men had attended many meetings together, but Randolph admitted that he did not always agree with his friend. Jacob had very strong views and was always convinced he was right. Now Randolph began to reach quieter streets where the air was slightly cleaner, and he would soon get to the point at which he would normally hail a carriage to take him home to the house.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?